Hello everybody, welcome to Brainstorm Lore, welcome back to Middle-earth, and welcome to an introduction to the Noldor Elves. You may be wondering as to why I decided to give this group of elves its own video, instead of lumping them in with the other two in the previous one. Well, it's primarily due to the fact that from this point on, the elves, and especially the Noldor, are going to become the focus of the story of Middle-earth. Up to this point we've been dealing mostly with godlike beings, Eru Ilúvatar, the Valar, Melkor, etc. And it's around the time that the elves first arrive into Mon that the focus shifts from the Valar to the elves. The Silmarillion, which is our primary source for all information about Middle-earth prior to The Hobbit, mostly focuses on the beginning of the world up through the First Age. There's then a very brief chapter that summarizes the Second Age, mostly focusing on the rise and fall of Númenor, and then an even briefer chapter on the Third Age, essentially all the events between the loss of the One Ring by Sauron up to Frodo leaving with Gandalf for the Grey Havens. Believe it or not, this does make sense. The Silmarillion, after all, refers to the Silmarils, the three gems that were created by the Noldor. The Silmarillion is about them, and therefore it is about their creators. And the Silmarils were only really relevant up until the end of the First Age and the War of Wrath. But I am getting a little ahead of myself here. First things first, who were the Noldor? For a start, the Noldor were those elves of the second original tribe that were convinced by Finwë, their first king, to accept the Valar's invitation to make the journey to the Undying Lands and live with the gods in Valinor. For the Noldor, the journey west was mostly uneventful. They weren't as eager to get to Valinor as the Vanyar were, but nor did they drag their feet as much as the Teleri. They were, in brief, the middle child of the three elven kindreds. In those early days, much like the other elves, the Noldor enjoyed a very close relationship with the Valar. But while the Vanyar were content to sit around writing poetry, and the Falmari concerned themselves with boats and the beauties of the ocean, the Noldor set their minds to making things of earth and rock and metal. As such, they were the personal favorites of Aule, the great smith of the Valar, who was delighted to finally have pupils to whom he could impart his skill and knowledge. It was the Noldor that constructed the city of Tirion, the first elven city in the Undying Lands. And it was also they who built the great harbor city of Aquilonde for the Falmari and their beautiful swan ships. The Noldor were a hard-working and inquisitive breed of elf, always hungry for knowledge and eager to discover new things. At some point during the Years of the Trees, Finwë, the Noldor king, took to wife a fair maiden by the name of Míriel, and within a very short time she bore him a son. Officially, he was named Cúru Finwë at his birth, but his mother gave the boy a name by which he would be remembered forever after. Fëanor, Spirit of Fire. An all-consuming fire, apparently, for shortly after giving birth, Míriel said to her husband, quote, "Never again shall I bear child, for strength that would have nourished the life of many has gone forth into Fëanor." Finwë was pretty upset at this because he'd wanted more children to enjoy the bliss of the Undying Lands. He was even more upset when he found out that apparently giving birth to his only son had sapped Míriel of her will to live. And I'm not kidding, the Silmarillion actually describes it like this. In the bearing of her son, Míriel was consumed in spirit and body, and after his birth she yearned for release from the labor of living. Understandably distraught, Finwë went to Manwë and asked if there was anything that could be done for her. The king of the Valar could only recommend that maybe Míriel needed a long rest, and instructed him to take her to the Gardens of Lórien, the Valar of Dreams. Unfortunately, this plan backfired rather badly. Míriel went to the Garden of Lórien, lay down to sleep, and simply died. Her soul left her body and entered the halls of Mondos. A grief-stricken Finwë spent a very, very long time beside his wife's body, constantly calling out her name, but she never responded. Some of the Maiar, the lesser spirits of Valinor, used their power to preserve Míriel and prevent her body from withering, but she never woke up again. Bit of an aside here, but this is one part of the Silmarillion that I've never really understood. Obviously, elves are immortal, and in this land hallowed by the gods themselves, even mortal beings don't die of old age. I can understand it if Miriel had died from complications. By her own testimony, the birth of Feanor was a very difficult one. But the fact that apparently giving birth to her only child deprived her of the will to live, this part of the story has always just confused me, and if anybody has a better understanding of it than I do, a mention in the comments section would be most appreciated. Anyway, back to the story. Eventually, though we are never told exactly how long it took, Finwë was able to recover from his grief, and he even remarried. His second wife was Indis, one of the Vanyar elves, and by her he had 4 children, 2 daughters, Findis and Irime, and 2 sons, Fingolfin and Finarfin. But of course, of all his children, it was Feanor whom Finwë loved best of all. And that pretty much is all there is to be said about Finwë, as from this point on, the focus shifts from him to his 3 sons. These 3 sons and their descendants would go on to influence Middle-earth for centuries to come, even after the First Age, the rise of men to dominance, and the elves began to fade. So, who were these sons of Finwë? Let's start with Finarfin, the youngest. Finarfin is often described as the wisest and fairest of Finwë's sons, both because he was the most likely to give good counsel, but also because of all his siblings, only he inherited the distinctive golden hair of his Vanyar mother. He went on to marry a Teleri elf named Erwin, the daughter of their king Olwe, and by her produced 4 children, Finrod, Angrod, Egnor, and Galadriel. Yes, that Galadriel. Already we see how the children of Finwë continue to shape events for centuries to come. Finarfin is described as a very quiet individual, very patient, always advising caution, and often playing the peacemaker, or trying to play the peacemaker anyway, between his brother Fingolfin and half-brother Feanor. He would always be the first to counsel against hasty and rash actions. Unfortunately, his counsels were rarely heeded, and the Noldor would suffer greatly as a result. Now, Fingolfin, the eldest of Finwë's sons by Indis. Fingolfin was not nearly as wise or as patient as his younger brother, but he more than made up for it in strength of character and strength of body. His people would remember him for his bravery and for the honor with which he treated others. His son would rule as king of Gondolin, the greatest and fairest of all elven cities. One of his grandsons, Gil-galad, would fight against Sauron alongside the kings of Númenor at the beginning of the Third Age. And one of his great-grandsons would be Elrond Half-Elven, Master of Rivendell. Through Elrond's brother Elros and his descendants, the line of Fingolfin would be tied by blood to that of the kings of Númenor, and by extension, Gondor. This means that Fingolfin is, however distantly, related to Aragorn, son of Arathorn, a character that most of us by this point know very well indeed. And finally, there was Feanor, the only son of Finwë by his first wife, Miriel. He was simultaneously the greatest of the Noldor, and also the one doomed to damn them. Now, this part here bears repeating. When Tolkien created the modern elf, he had originally intended them to be a representation of what humanity could have been had we remained sinless. Remember, Tolkien was a devout Catholic. Even in Lord of the Rings, where they don't figure as significantly as in the Silmarillion, you get the sense that the elves are the superiors of all other living things, morally as well as physically. They are closer to the gods, holier, ageless. But Tolkien also understood something that was equally important, that those that are capable of greater holiness are also capable of greater perfidy, that greater good can just as easily become greater evil. After all, was not Satan himself once the greatest of the angels, the closest of all to God? Yes, by the time of the War of the Ring, the elves of Middle-earth are very much these holier-than-thou beings, shaking their heads at the follies of the mortal races. But the reason that they are able to recognize these mistakes is that because once, long, long ago, they made mistakes that were just as great, if not greater, than those of men, dwarves, and even hobbits. Never mind the fact that they've also had centuries to learn from those terrible mistakes. It's this fallibility that makes Tolkien's elves special, what sets them apart from all the other pointy-eared knockoffs that have been created in the half-century since. But enough tangents, back to Fëanor. Fëanor was the firstborn and favorite son of Finwë. Among a race of elves that specialized in the making of things with their hands, Fëanor was without question the most gifted of his kind. None could match his skills, none could surpass them save Aule himself. He is described as tall, like most elves, with raven hair and piercing black eyes. He is responsible for inventing the modern elvish alphabet, known as Tangwar. He learned metallurgy from Matan, the greatest of the Noldor blacksmiths, soon surpassed his mentor, and even took his daughter Nerdanel to wife. By her, he would have 7 sons, and one day one of his grandsons, Celebrimbor, would be instrumental in the forging of the Rings of Power, specifically the 3 Elven Rings, and it was in fact thanks to Celebrimbor that Sauron was not able to corrupt them, as he was the 7 Dwarven Rings or the 9 Rings of Men. After mastering metallurgy, Fëanor turned his incredible talents to the making of gems. And then, at some point during what is known as the Noontide of Valinor, Fëanor undertook his greatest creation. Using 3 crystals of unknown substance, described only as being clearer than diamond and stronger than adamant, Fëanor managed to capture the light of the 2 trees of Valinor, Telperion and Laurelin, within their crystalline depths. And thus he created the Silmarils. The Valar marveled at their beauty, and Varda, their queen, hallowed them herself, declaring that no hand, either mortal, unclean, or tainted by evil, could ever so much as touch them without being burnt. So, yeah, Fëanor was an elf with incredible talent. Unfortunately, he also possessed an ego to match. Fëanor was an elf possessed of great hubris, that bane of all classical heroes. He was an elf quick to anger and stubborn in his purpose. His wife Nerdanel was the only one who was ever able to sway Fëanor from a decision once he'd made it, and even then only rarely. As the years passed in Valinor, Fëanor's pride grew, as did his jealousy. When he had first made the Silmarils, he had worn them openly upon his brow so that all may see their beauty, but as time passed, he became more and more possessive of them, and soon would show them to no one save his father, his wife, and his 7 sons. He loved the Silmarils more than any other of his creations, for in their making he had poured some of his own life force into them, and knew that he could never recreate them again, even were he to spend 1,000 years in the trying. In fairness, though, Fëanor had never been the most trusting of elves. His relations with his step-siblings, for example, had always been sour, especially when it came to Fingolfin, whom Fëanor suspected of seeking to supplant him as their father's favorite. Fingolfin, for his part, constantly chafed at Fëanor's presumptiveness and arrogance, proving that sibling rivalries are truly older than fiction. What I've just described here sounds like a recipe for disaster. But it didn't have to be. Yes, the elder sons of Finwë could barely tolerate each other, but that was hardly a deal-breaker to end the blissful days in Valinor. What happened next, however, was. Melkor, if you remember, had been defeated by the Valar and then sentenced to imprisonment in the halls of Mandos for 3 ages of the world. Well, at some point after the making of the Silmarils, Melkor's sentence was up, and he was about to be given what amounts to a divine parole hearing, overseen by Manwë. For however many centuries are in 3 ages, Melkor had been sitting in his prison, stewing in anger and hate. When he emerged, he had plans for himself, for the Valar, and especially for their new little pointy-eared friends. And on that ominous note, I will leave you. Next week, we'll find out just what Melkor's plots were and how exactly he was going to screw over the good guys this time. Until then. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and check out our website at studiobrainstorm.net. And if you have a story that you think is worth telling, we are more than happy to help you publish it. Thank you, and have a nice day.